The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, hi everybody. Welcome to Unit 6 of the Lunch and Learn series. We're looking at developing team culture today. This will be our last module together. So hopefully you have got a lot out of the last 5 units and have applied what you can in your own team environment. So we'll kick off, and I hope that you've had a chance to reflect and apply some of the skills that you've learned. So let's get underway and consider what we're going to be covering in this session. So what you're seeing in front of you now is a list of the topics that we've covered, and obviously we're down to the last one here, which is Unit 6, and really I'm hoping now that there's been some interesting insights and war stories that you might have in relation to how your team's performing. So I won't go back and reiterate on all the topics because I think you're aware of them, and if you've been involved in them you would know what they're about, and if you watched the video you would have known what they're about as well. So you might recall, just a quick recap on last time we met a fortnight ago, we were looking at the notion of conflict and negotiation. And what I asked you to do is to complete the diagnostic, which was the Kilman diagnostic. And what that diagnostic did was to show you your preferred style of conflict or negotiation. And the caveat there was that you shouldn't try to use the one that was the most popular, and that is the one that you're most interested in, too often, because different situations require different results or different ways of dealing with it. So to compete in one situation might require collaboration in another. So it is important that we use these different approaches in the right situation. In fact, there are 3 important variables. 1 is your preferred style, 2 is the situation you're dealing with, and 3, the person you're actually dealing with as well. So I hope you've had a chance to apply those. I hope you've had a chance to vary your conflict resolution style depending on the circumstances that you're in. And I hope that when you've got it wrong, which we all do, you've been able to swap and change and move into another particular strategy that might have been more effective for you. So send me an email and let me know how you got on with those, because it's important that we understand your success stories as well as some of your struggles. And your homework, of course, as I said, was really about applying those 5 strategies as much as you possibly can, and to vary your approach. And of course, the low scores on your diagnostic would suggest that perhaps you need to use those more readily. All right, so let's now move into our topic for today, which of course is team culture, which is an interesting topic. And I'm going to cover 3 things today in our session. I'm going to talk about generally what culture means, because we use the word freely, don't we? We talk about team culture, we talk about national culture, we talk about organizational culture. What do we actually mean by culture? What actually is it? And why is it applicable to your team? I would say to you that your team has a culture. Maybe you're not aware of it, but every time there's a group of people that meet on a regular basis, they themselves have a culture. They have an approach, a way of doing business. And hopefully I can give you some ways and strategies for developing team culture that might make your team even more efficient and effective. So that's the second thing we're going to do. Look at some strategies, look at some models, look at some ways and means of helping you to actually develop a more productive team. And the last thing I'm going to talk about is team identity, which is slightly different to culture, but it's important that you as the team leader craft a team identity. And I want to talk about how you might go about that and what you need to do in order to make that happen. So as usual, if you've got any questions, any comments, any observations, go to the right-hand side on the question box, type in your question, and I'll be happy to take it as we go. All right. Now, let's move on to the topic of culture. What actually do we mean by the term culture? Now, if you pick up 3 books, you'll probably get 3 definitions, and they've probably all got some commonality to them, but this is my definition, at least, of what culture is. And I've highlighted the key words in this definition because I just wanted to refer to those. I think they're important, those definitions. So it's the basic pattern of shared assumptions, values, and beliefs considered to be the correct way of thinking and acting on problems and opportunities facing the team. So the very first thing is it's a pattern of behaviour and it's a pattern of assumptions. So what you're going to see is a continual pattern of ways we do things around here. And normally when you've got a team culture, the team generally buys into that. So you've got, it's not just 1 or 2 persons. Everybody in the team kind of buys into that. Sometimes they're not even aware that they're doing it. It's just one of those subconscious things that occur. But what it does signal is what's perceived to be the correct way of thinking and acting. Now, it doesn't mean it is the correct way of thinking and acting, but it is certainly perceived that way. So, for example, if people habitually finish at 5 p.m. and don't stay any later and they're out the door, then that's perceived to be the correct way of doing things. And if somebody perhaps stayed back a little extra time, they would be breaking a so-called correct way of doing things, and that's how it works. So it's the way of dealing with situations as they arise. So that's a definition of culture. Now, it's one of those things you can either see or not see. There's some tangible things and there's some intangible things. So what you're seeing on this chart here is that if we use the good old iceberg, and we use it for lots of different reasons, usually when there's not always, when there's an iceberg in the water, there is a tip coming out of the water, and the majority of the iceberg is submerged in the water, so you can't see the majority of the iceberg. But the tip of the iceberg, which we use that term a lot, are the things that are very tangible in a workplace culture. So in a team, the way the team's structured, the language that they use, some of the rituals and ceremonies. Do we have morning teas to celebrate birthdays and the like? Some of the stories and the legends and some of those sorts of things are shared by people. All of those things are obvious, and if I came into your team and just sat there for a couple of hours, I would be able to work out what those overt characteristics were because I could see them, I could hear them, and because I could see them and I could hear them, it would be very obvious to me whether they were patterns of behaviour that were underpinning the way the team went about doing its business. But under the waterline, of course, there's a whole raft of different beliefs and values and assumptions that are not really spoken of, but are nevertheless thought about. So all the team members buy into these. So these are the beliefs that people have about the way the team should operate and the values that they share. And unless it's an overt set of values, it's pretty much internalized by everyone in the team. And these are some of the assumptions by which we go about and do business. So culture in teams is both overt and covert. So there are some things we can see, and there are some things, of course, that we can't see, but nevertheless are just as important. So you might say, which is more powerful? They're both powerful in their own way, but both of them combine very much to create the culture of the workplace. And that's why I'm sharing that with you. Now, why does a team have a culture? It's a good question that we should ask, because why do human beings develop this concept of culture around their organisation? Why do they have this? And there's a number of reasons for this, and I think it's important for you as the team leader to understand the reason why people do have a culture. What is the purpose of a culture? And if we start at 12 o'clock and work our way around clockwise, one's not necessarily more important than the other, but these all combine. So the very first one there is it serves as a sense-making mechanism. It gives people boundaries, if you like. It gives people parameters to work in for us to understand what's appropriate and inappropriate in a team. It's important, otherwise anything goes. So a person that's new to your team comes in, and one of the things that they're doing, whether they realize it or not, is they're getting a gauge on the culture of the workplace. They're thinking about how that culture is created. So they're watching, they're observing, they're listening. And of course, all of those things will become apparent to the person who's new in a team after a period of time. Some things will be obvious on day one, and some of those things are the tip of the iceberg that we talked about before, but there'll be other things that might take a couple of weeks or months before people get their head around it and understand what's acceptable and unacceptable in the work team. So as I've just mentioned, going around the circle, it creates some boundaries for us about what is acceptable and unacceptable behaviour. And those things are very, very important. And we need to understand, we human beings like parameters. We like to know where the line in the sand is. We want to know what is acceptable and unacceptable, and we tend to stick to the things that are acceptable and steer away from the things that are unacceptable. So it helps us create some boundaries. It also gives the team a sense of identity, and that is we kind of understand, what the team stands for. So we all want an identity and we all crave an identity, and what we try and do, of course, advertising agencies play on this all the time when they talk about a brand of a sports car or a certain type of food or whatever. We have a tendency to want to associate with that. Not all of us, but those that do purchase the product will probably want to be associated with that identity. So we go ahead and purchase it on the basis that it will assist us to gain a sense of identity around something. And it also, culture gives us a commitment beyond our self-interest. So we all have a self-interest, but the reality is that beyond our own self-interest, of course, we've got a team interest. And a culture helps individuals within the team understand that there's a bigger picture to play here, that we're all part of something larger than just our own self-interest. And finally, what a culture does is it gives us a sense of stability. And the stability means that we know exactly where we stand in relation to the team. When we come to work, there's a predictable way of going about the way we do things. There's a predictable way for us to engage with each other. There's a predictable way of us addressing each other. There's a predictable way of meeting. And all of those things add a degree of stability to us as a team member. And of course, we all crave stability in some way, shape or form. And of course, the culture gives us that stability. So I think it's important for us just to understand why we have culture and what it does for a team. So those things are very important. Now, one of the exercises that I've done in the past, and I think it's quite a fun exercise to do, and certainly I'd recommend that you try it out in your team. It gets a really interesting discussion going and people enjoy it, and it's very insightful, some of the responses that come out of it. And I'm going to share some of my clients and their responses to these questions. But you essentially pose 3 questions to your team. So you find a meeting when it's appropriate to discuss these things. And the first question that you ask people is, if you had to describe our team as a colour, what colour would it be and why? All right, you actually, you can either get people to write this down or get them to work in pairs, or simply just to have a conversation about this around the table. And you'll be fascinated by the things that come up. And the reason it's so powerful is that we're using metaphors. In this case, the metaphor, of course, is colour. Then you ask another question. If you had to describe your team or our team as an animal, what animal would it be and why? So what you're doing is you're creating, again, another metaphor, an animal. So they might say a horse, we're reliable, we get things done, we move in a predictable direction and so forth. And the final question you might ask is, if you had to describe your team as a motor vehicle, what would it be and why? And of course, again, they can pick whatever they choose to pick, and they have to give a reason why. Now, you'll find this is a very insightful exercise. It can be very, very useful to find out where people are at in relation to culture. So you get a quick handle on what people actually think about the team and the way the team does business and the culture that it exhibits. Let me give you an example of two clients that I worked with in the past. Whoops, it's not there. I don't have that slide. Apologies about that. But I remember doing this with a large transport company. In fact, they were in the railway business. And the morale was very, very low. And I asked them a pretty straightforward question. I asked them these three questions. And I remember the team I was working with. And what was really fascinating is that the common theme that was coming through was black. Black because we're not terribly exciting. We are slow to change. We're not terribly dynamic. So this was the feedback I was getting. And then I asked them, this team, railway team working in a railway organisation. I said, well, if you had to describe your team as an animal, what animal would it be and why? And they said an elephant. And you could probably work out why. They said slow to change, direction. Some people said an elephant because the elephant never forgets. So it was really insightful to hear what people had to say. Then I asked them, if you had to describe your team as a motor vehicle, what would it be and why? And this was fascinating because they came up with, the key one, it was an Australian company, they came up with a Holden. And I said, why? And they said, because, my father had worked here and my grandfather had worked here and I'm working here. It was kind of like a family sort of environment. And this was a pretty male-dominated environment, as you could imagine. And so we had that. So we had black, elephant, and Holden. And so instantly you can get a sense of what people are thinking. Now, that's not terribly positive, but I remember working with IBM. Now, I worked with IBM when it was in its heyday, when it was at the top of its game. It was number one. And I asked them the three questions, and the team came up with completely different answers. Their first answer to the question of colour was gold. And I said, why? Why did you select gold? And they said, pretty much because we're number one. And that was tremendous. So, we're number one, we're the leaders in the marketplace and so forth. I then said to them, well, how would you describe the team as what was the animal? And they said cheetah, fast moving, agile, can change direction reasonably quickly and so forth and so on. So again, a very positive self-image of their culture, which I thought was interesting. And the final question was, if you had to describe this organisation, or in particular your team, what would it be and why? And they described it as a Ferrari because we're top notch, we're the best at what we do. We have our competitors miles. This, as I said, this is in the heyday. So you can see that when you do this with your team, you can get some really good insight into how the team sees themselves. So give it a go. Now, the other thing you might like to do if you're adventurous is that you could ask people what colour, what animal, and what vehicle would they describe the team currently. Then once you've done that, you can then, once you've collected all that information, you can then say to the team, okay, magic wand time, if we could be the team that was achieving its maximum capacity, what colour would it be, what animal, and what vehicle? Now, inevitably, you're going to get a different result the second time than the first time, and that's not a problem. And then you can turn the conversation towards the team about how do we go from where you said we are to where we need to be. What do we need to do to get us from where we are to where we need to be? And so that can be a really good team building exercise, and one that gives you a really good insight into how people see themselves, not themselves personally, but how they see their team. So that's very, very powerful. Hi, Elizabeth. Just noticed you there. Hi. So you can do those things in a team in a very constructive way, and it is very, very powerful. Okay, so if you've got any questions or comments or observations, you know what to do. Just type them in the question box there as well. All right, now look, there's varying degrees of how you go about this, and I'm not suggesting that you might want to do this with your team, but there's another sort of look at teams and team culture, and this one looks at the key dimensions of culture. And you'll notice that there's a whole raft of different headings down the page there. It's quite a busy slide, I realise that. But the argument is that all of these things are dimensions around team culture. So, for example, how much initiative do people feel that they have in a team? Now, if you were going to do this with your team, you might like to ask people to rate them on a scale of 1 to 5. 5 is high, 1 is low. So, for example, you might say, how much initiative, what degree of freedom and autonomy do people have in this team to do what they want, how they want, in terms of the work that they do? And of course, if they rate that a 5 or even a 4, that would suggest that there's a perception that people have a high degree of autonomy or to show individual initiative in the team. And of course, this depends on the industry as well. All right, so in a health and safety environment, you don't want people to have high degrees of autonomy. Having said that, though, in an IT startup company, you probably do want that. So you've got to take into account the industry you're in as well. How risk tolerant are we on a scale of 1 to 5? So are we willing to take risks, or do we play it safe? Now, again, you've got to take into account the industry you're in. So if it's a government department, obviously, you don't want people running around taking risks. You want people to do things by the book. So you have to temper it with the climate that you're in. What about direction? The degree to which the team has a very clear direction as to what they're doing. Again, it depends on the purpose of the team, whether it's clear what that direction is. And if it is pretty clear, then people are going to rate that highly. What about integration? The degree to which the team is encouraged to be open to in a coordinated manner. How integrated is the team, or is it a team of individuals who kind of do their own thing? So that in itself can be interesting. And again, it depends on the structure of the team and so forth. What about management contact, the degree to which management provides communication, assistance and support to team members? Is that high? Is that low? You might want to talk about that. The degree of identity, the degree to which team members identify with the team more than the organisation. So, how how high is our sense of identity. The reward system used, the degree to which rewards are allocated based on performance. Now, rewards may not be monetary, and I know some of you are working in government agencies and not-for-profit. Rewards may not be monetary, but it might be the way people are praised, the way their work is reinforced. So, the degree to which those are based on performance. Obviously, if it was a 1, then it would suggest that it's not really based on performance. How conflict tolerant are people in the team? So we've just done the module, haven't we, on conflict and negotiation. So how tolerant are people? How open are people to be critical? Are people encouraged to air their views around the table at a team meeting, or do people kind of sweep things under the carpet and don't deal with things that they should, so that there are a whole lot of elephants in the room? So that can be interesting. The communication patterns, the degree to which the organisational communications are restricted to a clear line or chain of command. So if it's a hierarchical organisation, it would probably be high, but if it's a fairly flat structure, then it would probably be low. So, those sorts of things come into play as well. So that's a more involved process, but, try the colour, animal and the vehicle one. Can be a lot of fun and just as insightful as what you've got in front of you here. All right, so let's have a look at the next concept. Now, O'Reilly and Tushman wrote a very famous article in the Harvard Business Review some years ago, and I think what was famous about it is the concept that they called an ambidextrous organisation or an ambidextrous team. What ambidextrous means, of course, is that we can use both hands with equal proficiency. So, for example, if you're a tennis player and you're ambidextrous as a tennis player, you may not be in other areas, you can play with your right hand or your left hand. And you can do that with a reasonable equal degree of efficiency. That's pretty much the common terminology for ambidexterity. But what O'Reilly and his colleague were talking about in the context of culture in a team is that he argues, and I think he's right, is that we can be ambidextrous in our team. In other words, on the one hand, we can be very regulatory, very systematic, very deliberate, and very structured, which of course is one way, and of course it depends on what it is. But he argues, or they argue, that on the other hand, we can also be quite exploratory or blue sky. So in the right time, in the right place, the team can show a degree of creativity and so forth. Now, if you're going to create a team that's ambidextrous, according to this definition, then you've got to, as the leader, encourage that. So you can't just give lip service to this. You actually have to create that culture that will allow that to happen. Because let's face it, not everything is required. Not everything has to be bound in a set of rules and regulations. However, there are some things, of course, that require people to think creatively or outside the box, whichever way you want to look at it. And it's those things that you need to encourage in the right place and the right time. So a very practical exercise that you might like to try is you get a whiteboard out and you get your team around there and you draw 2 lines down the page on the whiteboard. So you start so you've got basically 3 columns. And you start on the left-hand side and you ask your team, what are all the things that we do in our team that require us to do it by the book? In other words, there's no movement for creativity. We're expected to do things in a stock standard way. And then you write up all those things on that list. And I would imagine that you won't be short of answers there because most teams have got a lot of structure around them, sometimes arguably too much. But nevertheless, you write all those things up, and then you go to the far end, that is the right-hand side, and you ask people, what are all the things where we have complete freedom and autonomy to be able to decide how we do things? Now, you'll find that people might struggle with that, particularly if it's a fairly bureaucratic organisation. But you make a list of all of those things and you write them up there. What are all those things that we can be quite creative and blue sky thinking, basically? So keep urging people to contribute to that. Now, those two are the extremes. So we've got on the left-hand side, we've got a whole lot of areas where you've got to do it by the book. And on the right-hand side, there are things that can be done very much in a spontaneous and creative way. Now, the middle column is where things can either be done by the book or creatively. So these are the things that will get your team into a little bit of strife. So you can ask people and say, what are some of the things that really do have a structure around them, but whether we follow that structure or not, it probably doesn't matter completely. And you might have to coach people through this, and then you get a list of things in the middle. And you talk about those things, and you encourage people perhaps to be more creative in those areas where there's what we call a grey area. And by doing that, you are creating an ambidextrous team because you're giving people, yep, we all agree that these are the things that we need to do by the book. We also agree that there are things over here that we need to be done our own way, but there's a whole raft of things in the middle that could also go over on the right-hand side under the things that could be done in our own way. So that can be very, very useful, is to create that ambidextrous culture that O'Reilly and his colleague talk about in the Harvard Business Review. Now, I put together this model that's coming up on your, here it is on your screen now, which is the organizational agility model. I think we've been banging on for many years now about becoming agile. We're hearing it all the time. You know, we need to be agile, and we do. We all have to be agile. But my problem with that was that I didn't think that there was a very clear distinction about what that meant in reality. So I put together this model and suggested that there are 7 things that are important if we were trying to measure agility in a team or an organization. And I'm just going to go through these briefly with you, and you can use these as a conversation opener or even just for your own evaluation, as you're probably doing now with your team. So if we start at 12 o'clock and move our way around, we start with innovation. Now, I'm not talking about the Google type of innovation here. I'm talking about doing things differently and so forth. And all of us, regardless of whether we're government, not-for-profit, or private sector, need at times to create innovative solutions to problems. And the argument here is that we need to do these things quickly. So organizations that can be quite innovative very quickly have what we call they have an advantage because they're in the market quickly and they can do those things quickly. So that's one form of agility, not the only one, but it's certainly one form. And then there's processing. How quickly and efficiently can we process the work that we need to do throughout our team? So in a bureaucracy, of course, it's not normally going to take a lot longer because there's got to be more hands that see it. There's more processes that have to be adhered to and so forth. So how can we process things more efficiently and effectively? So that's part of agility, to be agile in how we do that. We don't want, of course, not to do due process and compliance. That's obviously not a good idea. But we want to be processing things as quickly as we possibly can while not sacrificing quality. Now, recovery speed is the speed of when we make mistakes, and we all do, individually and collectively. Human beings make mistakes. Surprise, surprise. Some of us don't like to admit it, but we all do. And when we make mistakes, the question then is, how do we recover from those mistakes quickly? That's the question, not how do we stop mistakes. Obviously, it's good to stop mistakes, but in many cases, once that mistake's been made, the question then becomes, how do we recover quickly? And that is important because, you know, the old example, if you go to a restaurant, you have a meal and they bring out the wrong meal, the measure of whether you're going to be totally frustrated or not is how quickly they can rectify that and bring you the right meal. And if they do that reasonably quickly and make it a priority, some of us can be quite forgiving about that. Continuous improvement, as distinct from innovation, is about how we can continually upgrade and develop our systems and processes and the way we do things. That's part of agility. Customer responsiveness is everything that you say, think, and do should be aligned with your end user, whoever they are. And so, unfortunately, that doesn't happen in real life. Although it sounds great in theory, a lot of people don't actually have the end user in mind when they design processes, think about how they're going to do things, and that can be problematic. So customer responsiveness is another one of those parts of agility. Problem solving. So how agile can we be when we solve problems? And that becomes another form of agility. And finally, how quickly can we change direction? So the government's introduced a new funding arrangement, or the market has changed, or there's a new market developed. How quickly are we able to agilely be able to capture that? So those are the 7 parameters around agility, and I think all of us, regardless of what organisation you are in, need to become more agile in the way we do business. And you could use this as a little bit of a assessment, if you like, of your own team, or even a conversation starter with your own team around these areas. Now, another approach that you can use that can be very, very powerful if you're trying to develop a culture in your team is a concept called the Team Values Charter. Now, this is something that I developed a few years ago, and I'm quite surprised at how effective it is. I mean, I knew it was going to be effective, but it's really taken off, and there are lots of teams, both here in Australia and overseas, that are using this Team Values Charter. The Team Values Charter is simply you asking your team 4 questions. So again, this is an exercise where you get everyone around the table, you ask them to bring a pen and paper, or if they want to tap it out on an iPad, they can do so, and you ask them 4 simple questions. Question 1 is, what is one value that's important to you when working in this team? Now, this is distinct from the organisational values, so just put them aside. These are the values around which the team like to operate together in the team environment. So that becomes the question. So let me give you an example. So I might say respect. Okay, so that's my value. That is one of my values, but that's my value. So when I'm working in a team, I like to feel respect is present. So the next question that you ask your team, and you get them to write this down, the reason they write it down is so that they can start to think a little bit more deeply about it. It's not just something off the cuff. Don't ask them to do this before they come to the team meeting, because you'll find that the law of averages is that someone will forget to do it, and then you've got to wait for that person to gather their thoughts. So do it in a team meeting. So the second question is, what is your definition of that value? So if you were asking me, I might say respect is when people are prepared to listen to others, even when they may not agree with their point of view. Okay, to me that's respect. To somebody else, respect might mean something completely different, but nevertheless, that's my definition of respect. All right, so I share that. And then question 3 is, why is that value important to me? Now, as a team leader, if you ask people why that value is important to you, that gives you a very good insight into that person and the way they're thinking. So it is a good question to ask. So I might say, I like to feel that I'm respected and that my opinions are valued when I'm working with others. That'd be my kind of my answer to that question. And then the final question is, what behaviours would be consistent with that value? So in other words, this is where the rubber meets the road. This is where people talk about the values as they are enacted. So I might say, if you ask me, that, not interrupting someone else when they speak. So to me, that would be a behaviour that would be consistent with respect. So you go around the table and you ask people to share that knowledge, that information with each other. You start yourself, because it's really important that you do this. Set the tone, read yours out first, and then go around the table and try and encourage conversation. You'll be surprised at how effective this is, because people don't argue with their own data. This values charter has been created by your team. And because you've created it as a team, the team will adhere to it because it's their information. It's not a plaque on the wall that's been put together by a couple of senior managers in a room. This is a charter that's been created by each and every one of your team members. So that's something you might like to try. It works extremely well, folks. I can't recommend it highly enough. So what I want to do at this stage is talk a little bit around the concept of team identity, which is the third element of what we're going to talk about today. And if you've got any questions, then I'm happy to answer those. I do have a question here on the team values charter. The question is, what do you do with the information once it's collected? Yeah, great question. Look, you can do a couple of things. You can create the plaque on the wall if you want. I've seen teams frame them on the wall in the meeting room where they're at. You can put it on a computer screen. Everyone in the team is, they can see it. They need to get a copy of it, because obviously if you're going through this exercise, the exercise is to create the charter. Right? Sure, the conversation's very good and it's useful and you will hear some interesting things. But at the end of the day, what you're really trying to do is to create a charter about how people will treat each other when they're working in a team. So I would publish it and I would send it out to everybody, and I would at times refer to it. Now, as a team leader, you are in a position to be able to review critical incidents and examples in the workplace around the value statement. So, for example, you could say to someone, do you think that how you dealt with that other stakeholder was consistent with our charter around respect? And get them to evaluate their own behaviour. You don't have to do it yourself, and that can be very powerful. So get the person, so as a leader, you can use the team values charter to actually create some thought-provoking feedback to people to think more clearly about whether or not they're following that charter. So it's really powerful and it works really well. Now, team identity, I've come up with this model because when you're creating an identity around your team, whether you realize it or not, you're actually using 3 strategies. And I'm just going to talk about each of these 3. And these 3 strategies are vital. Now, if you overuse them, they're counterproductive, like most things. Equally, if you don't try to use them deliberately, you are probably sabotaging your team. You may not realize it, but that's what you'd be doing. Now, let's talk about each one. So buffering Buffering is how you protect your team from outside influences. So obviously you'd be aware that your team doesn't work in a vacuum. You work with lots of different stakeholders, both internally and externally, and that's very true. But often the teams will impose upon you, or different stakeholders will impose upon you, what might be unrealistic expectations. Now, you've got to protect your team to a certain degree from those external forces, because if you don't, they can actually ruin a team. Now, let me give an example. You've got a computer station set up in your team, and there's one of your team members who perhaps is, that there's a vacancy in your team, and it's on the organisational chart, so that vacancy will be filled in due course. But at the moment, it's not being filled. So you've got this workstation set up there. Now, somebody in another team in your organisation needs a computer. And so what they do is they take that computer from your workstation, and the person that's going to start, who happens to be starting in 3 weeks' time, is going to be left with a workstation with no computer. Now, you might think that's a bit harsh, but unless you protect that resource, you're actually allowing other people to cannibalize your resources inside your team. So it's really important that buffering is really around this concept of being able to make sure that you're protecting the resources of the team. Now, clearly, if you do this too much and you're too heavy-handed about this, then obviously you're going to be seen as a bit of an empire builder, and no one might want to refer to you, and no one's going to cooperate with your team for the simple reason that you're not cooperating with them. So you've got to do this sensitively, but if you don't do it to a certain extent, then it's true that other forces outside your team will cannibalize your resources and make it more difficult for you to be able to achieve the purpose that you've got as a team. So a team leader protects itself from other forces to a certain degree in order to be able to achieve certain results. The second thing, so that's an internal protection mechanism. The second strategy is what we call bridging. Now, bridging is a concept where you are reaching out to key stakeholders. Now, no team, as I said earlier, works in isolation. We all work with other entities. We can't achieve what we can achieve without the input from other entities. Some of them are external to the organisation, of course, some of them are internal. So reaching out to other entities in the organisation is critically important for team success. So this is actually the opposite of buffering. This is about building up good stakeholder relationships and maintaining those relationships to allow the team to achieve its success. So it's really important that, and of course you can use a stakeholder mapping exercise here with your team. Just get your team around, draw a big circle in the center of your whiteboard, and then you ask people to identify all the stakeholders that your team deals with. And then you keep writing and make sure you've got about 10. So stakeholders could be everyone from the team leader's manager through to people in the community, through to government agencies, could be anybody, but basically you rely to a certain degree on these stakeholders in order to do your job properly as a team. So you get them all up there, and then you ask another question. You say, let's rate them on a scale of 1 to 5 in terms of their level of importance for the team. So 5 means they're critically important. So your boss, if you're the team leader, your boss, I would suggest, is probably a 5, because quite frankly, without their consent and their support, there's very little you and your team can do to achieve success. So they would rate a 5. But a government agency that you only report to once a year might be rated a 2 or a 1 even. So you rate all these on a scale of 1 to 5, and then you ask, the third element of this is that you look at your at your fives. You'll probably find there's only a handful. There might be 3 fives on your list. And then you say to your team, what are we able to do or not do that will create a better, more productive working relationship with this stakeholder? What can we do to bridge from where we are to that stakeholder? What can we do? So bridging is about reaching out and to build more constructive alliances with those people you rely on to get your work done. Now, the last one there is building, and building is a process where you actually are building team esprit de corps, you're building culture. And of course, our session today is all about that. So building is about doing an internal process of building a stronger team culture. So what I just went through with you, which was the team values profile, is something that would be a building activity in your team. So in other words, it creates a better culture in your team. So you can see the two of them are internal and one of them's external. So buffering is an internal protection mechanism. Building is an internal protection mechanism in the sense that you're building a team. And bridging is a reaching out, that is a stakeholder process of reaching out to others when you need their assistance. So you can understand from a team leader's point of view, you need to have those 3 plates spinning in the air at once. Again, you can overdo it. You can create too strong a culture, building strategy. You can create such a strong culture that no one can penetrate it, right? So any of these can be done too much. You can do too much of any of these. But if you don't attend to them, as I mentioned, you're going to get a situation where your team identity is nowhere near as strong as it could be. And that, of course, is not going to be useful for you in terms of getting what you need done. So have a think about that process. And I've got some homework for you, and we're just coming to an end now. And what I want you to do is to implement a team. I want you to implement a team culture strategy. I want you to go ahead and take one of the ideas that I've given you today and build on it. Now, I've given you myriad ideas, so that you don't. Some of them you might like, some of them you might dislike, but I'd like you to take one away with you and build on it to an extent where you can assist building that team culture that we've talked about. So folks, that's pretty much it. That's our last session. I should also point out to you before I finish up that I have another Lunch and Learn series on the 15th of February. So if there's somebody in your organisation that you believe would be suited to that, can you let me know, or at least let them know that they can contact me? So if you found this useful, you might like to share these slides when you get them, when I send them out to you, with other people in your organisation that might benefit from the Lunch and Learn series. So just a quick plug at the end, but what I also want to say to you is thank you very much for the opportunity of working with you. I've really enjoyed it. I hope you've got something useful out of it. I hope that it's met with your expectations. I hope it exceeded your expectations. I hope you've been able to apply some of the skills and some of the thoughts to build a more robust team, a more productive and effective team. So that brings us to an end of the Lunch and Learn series, and I just wanted to thank everyone very much for your involvement. I'd like to wish you all a wonderful weekend, and I'd like to say thank you very much for involving yourself in this program. Thank you and goodbye.